It is, I am thine, O Lord. There you go. 666. Listen. I am thine, O Lord, I have heard thy voice, and in told thy love to me. But I long to rise in the arms of faith, and be closer drawn to thee. Draw me nearer, nearer, blessed Lord, to the cross thou hast died. Draw me nearer, 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 blessed Lord, to thy precious leading side. Consecrate me now to thy service, Lord, by the power of grace divine. Let my soul look up with a steadfast hope, and my will be lost in thine. Draw me nearer, nearer, blessed Lord, to the cross where thou hast died. Draw me nearer, 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 blessed Lord, to thy precious bleeding side. There are depths of love that I cannot know till I cross the narrow sea. There are heights of joy that I may not reach till I rest in peace with thee. Draw me nearer, nearer, blessed Lord, to the cross where thou hast died. Draw me nearer, 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 blessed Lord, to thy precious bleeding side. Page 742. 742. This will be the song for the lesson. We'll turn over to Brother Ron. 742. When upon my pillows you are tempest tossed, when you are discouraged thinking all is lost, count your many blessings, make them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord hath done. Count your blessings, make them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God hath done. Are you ever burdened with the load of care? Does the crossing heavy you are called to bear? Count your many blessings and bring down the fire, and you will be singing as the days go by. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God hath done. So amid the conflict, whether great or small, do not be discouraged, God is over all. Count your many blessings, angels will attend, help and comfort, give you through your journey's end. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God hath done. please mark your song book page 909, 909 will be the song after the lesson.
Good evening, class, or church, I guess. That's everybody. All right. Haggai is one of those prophets. The prophets that we have studied, or the prophets that are even in the Old Testament there, he's probably one of the ones that has one of the most positive messages going. Even the bad part, he tells us what they did, God tells us what they did wrong and how to correct it. It's not a lot of poetry. It's pretty easy for us to understand. He didn't prophesy for very long. Let's see. Let's try to advance this. But his main priority came with just a little bit of history about Haggai, because we don't know. I think he came with the first group of returned exiles was Zerubbabel. The reason I say I think is because his name isn't listed in that big long list that Ezra gave, whereas Zechariah is. But they had to be in there somewhere. And he prophesied just a couple of months before Zechariah. So my guess is that he came with that first group. His overall theme kind of here is, I titled this lesson, Rebuilding Priorities. Sir Edmund Burke said, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And that kind of seems like where they were at right now. The Israelites they came back from exile. They got started, and they really expected the Messianic age to kick in. That's what they were looking for. So they sat down and they just didn't do anything. A little bit like the Christians, if you remember in the first century, Paul talks about it in, I think it's Philippians or Colossians, how they needed to get to work. A lot of them thought that Jesus was going to come back right away. Once the church was established, Jesus was going to be back right away. And they sat down and just quit doing stuff, didn't do anything. So Haggai's theme, as I see it, is priorities. Good priorities and bad priorities, and what their consequences are. Now, the reason he prophesied was to get the people fired up and to rebuild the temple. A little bit about prophecy, just a real quick thing about prophecy. What is the first thing that comes into your mind when you think of prophecy? God speaking. That's what it is. God speaking. I think a lot of people, we define things and then we get them in our heads that prophecy is all about foretelling the future. It's all about something that's going on. We prophesy every time we read the Bible. Those are God's words, and they're coming out of our mouths. And that's what a prophet was. He was a spokesperson for God. And most of this involves stuff that had happened, and it was presently happening, and not very much had to do with anything that was going to happen. So most of Haggai's prophecy is all about what they've been doing. There are a couple of places there that he does talk about the future, I believe. Because, and I say that only because what he said there didn't come true in those people's lifetime, so it was for something else that was on farther on down the line. It's kind of like how people define words. I know Christians that won't fly because God said, "Lo, I'll be with you." Well, they got the word "lo" interpreted wrong. Anyway, that's just okay. Here's where he's at. We came back from exile with Zerubbabel and all of the people in the Cyrus the First, Cyrus the Great, his reign, about 538. Took them a little while to get back, a little while to get organized. 536, they start the temple. They lay the foundation. And then nothing happens until we have here in Haggai 1:1 in the second year of Darius the king. Now, the reason nothing happened was, we go back here to Ezra 4:4, and it said the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purposes all of the days of Cyrus of Persia, even up until Darius the king of Persia. So if we go back there and we see that they came back here, and all the way up until here, they didn't do anything. About 20 years there that the temple foundation sat, and nothing was done. I underlined and redlined this word because it's different than any of the other prophets. The word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. So he was speaking to the two head guys, and they in turn took it to the people. In the second year of Darius, puts it about 520. And God asked them a question. Okay? These people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. That was what they've been saying for the last 20 years because these people had so discouraged them. And we read about that in Ezra, that talk about them frustrating them, trying to get it going and all of that. Tobias and some others. Wrong direction. And Haggai said, is it a time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses? They're all dwelling in their own houses, while this house lies in ruins. This is what's happening. Consider your ways, he says. That's why I talk about, this is talking about priorities. Think about how you've been acting for the last 20 years. You have sowed a lot, but you have harvested almost nothing. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you don't ever get your fill. You clothe yourself, but nobody is warm. And when you work, you put your money in a bag that has holes in it and it falls right through. Those are your priorities. You've been really diligently seeking after your own good, and this is what it's come to. This is my priority. Consider your ways. Go up to the hills and bring wood and build the house that I may take pleasure in it, and that I may be glorified, says the Lord. Let me ask you a question. Did God have to have a house built there in Judah in order for good things to happen to them? Was that something that he needed? No. No. Think about my priorities versus his priorities. The paltry amount that I give on Sunday, does he need every penny of that in order to make the church continue to function? He says the gold is mine, the silver is mine, it's all mine, cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. It goes to attitude and it goes to priorities. Where are our priorities? What are we thinking about first? Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. You won't have to worry, Jesus told us. Haggai is one of those guys. It's a little bit like John the Baptist to Jesus. Haggai is just a 3-month little stint that he did, and then Zerubbabel came along and really, or Zechariah came along and just really laid out a whole gigantic thing that's hard to understand, but it can be understood. But it's a tough one. It's an apocalyptic literature, a lot of messianic prophecies. But Haggai is pretty simple and straightforward. You got to get your priorities right. You haven't been doing this right, and all of this has happened to you. You've been thinking about yourselves, and this is how it's worked. Now, think about God. Think about the things that pertain to life and godliness, and get that in your mind first, and I'll show you what I can do. And if you read this, you'll know how they responded. Now, he told that to Zerubbabel and Joshua and all of the people, and they responded, said, yep, we'll do it. And what was God's response in 1:13? You'll do it. I'll be with you. I'm going to be there to help you out. How long did it take for their response to turn from words into actions? Well, if you compare the first verse versus the last verse, it looks like it's about 3 months. No, 3 weeks. About 3 weeks before, from the time Haggai told them you need to get busy to the time they started and they got busy. So they didn't dilly-dally around too much. They went right after it. But then how long did it take them to finish? In the second year of Darius to the 6th year of Darius, so it took them about 4 years. But they built it with the few people that they had and as little resources as they had. They built it. And God blessed them the whole entire time. And then he started asking them some questions about who saw this back when, before it got destroyed. It was a pretty nice place. Solomon's temple. How does it look to you now? I didn't quite understand that because when I started reading the dimensions of Solomon's temple, this one was actually bigger. The one that Cyrus told him to build was actually bigger. But it must not have been as glorious. It must have been just built out of rock and wood and brick and mud. I don't know what all they used. I guess rock. Now,
all the gold overlay and all that stuff.
Yeah, Solomon really decorated the place up in a huge bronze sea and a huge altar and big courtyard and everything else. The temple itself was a little bit smaller than this one was. This was more square, and then the pictures that they have are all different, but the dimensions that they give, for Cyrus gave for the dimensions, was pretty much square. But he told them, even though this doesn't look as good as what you thought you had in the past. How many times, I find myself as I get older, saying, in them good old days, them days years ago, they were a lot better than the days are now. But he's telling them, don't think about that. Don't say, the old was better than the new, and it was better back then, and this thing don't look like nothing. So, that doesn't encourage me very much, because I used to have a big gold brick building to worship in. Now I got this little cement hut. But that's not what it was about, the building. Be strong and work, for I am with you, declares the Lord. My spirit remains in your midst. Fear not, I will fill this house with glory. And the latter glory will be greater than the former. And it was. Herod's temple not only looked bigger and looked brighter and was, but it was the difference between the glory of having the Shekinah glory there and having Jesus Christ as the center of the in the temple and the whole, and in the head of the church and the spiritual part of it. The glory is way much bigger than the physical glory ever was. And then he asked them this question about the meat. And they probably understood this a lot more than I did. And I worked on this a lot trying to figure out what it was. If you put a piece of meat, said ask the priest, if you put a piece of meat in the fold of your garment and it touches something, does it make it holy? Now the meat was holy when it was in their garment because apparently it was from the sacrifices. And maybe they carried it like that. If you touch something with the hem of your garment, does it make it holy? And they said no. Apparently that was the right answer. Because then he asked the other question, well, if you are unclean and you touch any of these things, does it make them unclean? And they said yes. Apparently that was the right answer too. He said, because so it is with this people. Their priorities have been wrong, and so everything they touch has fallen apart. I could never do a right thing with a wrong attitude or a wrong motive or do it in the wrong way, do a right thing in the wrong way and have it come out right. That's kind of the similarity I think that I got out of that. Their priorities were on themselves, so everything they touched, the money bags had holes in them, their crops, they went to their crops and there wasn't anything there to eat, and they had famine and they had all this going on. He said, from this point on, though, you do right and you watch what I'm going to do. You watch what I'm going to do. I will be with you. At the end of chapter 2 there, this is where I think he's talking about prophesying, things that are to come. I think in the main reference, this is the messianic reference of anything that's in here. He spoke to Zerubbabel personally, and since it didn't come to pass in his lifetime, therefore he was telling of a future event. And the Greeks did defeat many kingdoms, and the Romans did defeat even more kingdoms. And the Messiah did come through Zerubbabel's bloodline. So the lessons that we get from Haggai are this. Consider your ways. Make godly priorities and godly choices. Be strong and work. And be patient and wait on the Lord. Now we bring those lessons, that's what he was telling them to do. And that worked out pretty good, even though in all of those things there wasn't really, the promises that were in there was promises that he was going to do for Zerubbabel or through Zerubbabel when the Messiah came. Doesn't really seem to be any, God has two kinds of promises. I will do this. That's an unconditional promise. Doesn't depend on us. Whether we follow his instructions or not, that's going to happen. And then we have unconditional or conditional promises. I will do this if you do this. If you obey my word, I will bless you. If you are faithful until the end, I will give you a crown of righteousness. Little tiny word in there said it changes it from unconditional to conditional. So consider your ways, God's priorities, the things that God said He was going to do, and nowhere in here do we see an if, but I think if is kind of implied because when we get to Malachi and read Malachi, we'll find out that they got the temple built in the 4 years. And then they pretty much didn't do anything for another 100 years. And then Nehemiah came and fired them up again and they built the wall. But by the time they were building the wall and getting all of that in there, they were starting to give sacrifices that were lame and sick and blind and all of the things that he said, don't give that to your governor and see where it goes. Why are you treating me like this? So they didn't hold fast to the priorities that he wanted them to. They held fast to them long enough to get the work done, and then kind of slid back. And then you see that whole 400 years between Malachi and Matthew that was just it was a downward slide. It was a disaster. By the time Jesus came there just was nobody that even recognized him. Very few.
I was keeping my mind in Hebrews chapter 12, it's like he's sort of referring to this prophecy in Haggai, because he talks about receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Other things are going to be shaken, but not this kingdom.
Yeah.
Hebrews 12, 25 to 29.
And then, and all the way back to Daniel, that he talks about during that time, during the reign of these kings, these kingdoms are all going to fall, and I'm going to cut a stone out of the mountain, and it's going to roll down, and it's going to become a stone as big as the earth, and crush all of these kingdoms, and it won't be able to be shaken. And those things refer to things that were happening that are messianic. Now, we'll see that when we get to Zechariah. There's just tons. I think I counted like 41 or 45 messianic prophecies in Zechariah. Really, there's just the 2 of them in Haggai, pretty much at the last of chapter 2 there, that he talks about being Zerubbabel being a signet on his hand, and that he's going to shake these kingdoms, and that the Messiah was going to come, I guess, he did come from Zerubbabel's line, but that's what your conclusion would be out of that. This is another verse that would be good for us today to get a lesson from Haggai. Whoever knows to do a right thing and fails to do it, for him it is sin. These pews aren't going to just fill up by themselves if we just sit around and don't say anything to anybody. We have to work at it. We have to tell people. We have to invite people. We have to think that, that there's work to be done. I know we work hard at our jobs and everything. They try to keep us out of circulation from each other. But we have to find a way to keep moving forward and to trust God and to put our priorities, make sure it's so easy for me. I'll go all of a sudden, I'll say, when was the last time that I really did any serious Bible study? I know what it says, but when did I study it last? I'm struggling to find myself thinking about that. I can't remember when it was. Well, it's been 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. And when I was a younger man and we had cattle and we did branding and stuff like that, we used propane fires. Sometimes we used regular wood fires, but we'd stick the branding irons in the fire. And that's what we brand the cattle with. Stick it on the cattle and put your brand on there. And it works as long as you keep it hot. You leave it out of that fire for very long, it's still a branding iron, but you could stick that cow 100 times and it won't put a brand on there. And so I find sometimes that's where, when my priorities start slipping into thinking about myself all of the time and not God, and I'm wondering why my lessons don't come together the way that they should, or I'm not talking to people maybe the way that I should, or that I think I ought to. I'm not sharing good news around them. Because I kind of left that thing out of the fire for a while. And a lot of Christians are going to have to worry about that during this last time because, there's some big congregations that haven't been able to meet for 3 or 4 months. That's a long time to be out of the fire, out of fellowship with each other, out of touch with each other, for things to continue to work strong the way that they did before all of this happened.
Amen.
So I guess what I'm saying, what I learned out of Haggai was there's good priorities and there's bad priorities, and it's pretty straightforward. Good priorities have good consequences. Bad priorities have bad consequences. That was where my lesson ended originally. I put some other things in here because we talked about when I was doing these lessons a few years back, the question came up, well, Ezra and Haggai don't jihad on the order of who was kings and stuff like that. Ezra doesn't mention Cambyses and Smyrna. Well, there's some explanations for that, and I put a few things down on historical, talking about the kings of the Medes and the Persians, and people will try to use discrepancies like that to just get you away from the message. But the message of Haggai is pretty straightforward and simple. You need to get your priorities right. Consider the ways that you're doing it. Consider the motive that you have for doing what you're doing, because you can't do something good with a wrong motive. So consider not only your priorities, but consider your motive for that priority. Are you just trying to check off a box on a whole bunch of things that you have that's in the law and you need to check that off? Or are you doing it because this is what God wants you to do and this is the way you need to pattern your life? You need to have these check boxes in your mind, but they need to be down here too, because it has to be a priority. There has to be a good reason for you to want to do those things. I had some things about some interesting things about the first wave of exiles to the first wave of returnees. Well, when the foundation of the church was laid, or foundation of the temple was laid, 70 years. Told them 70 years you're going to be in exile. Well, some of them didn't go into exile until 20 years later, 586. Interesting. Temple was reached or finished in 526. No, 516, excuse me, 516. 70 years after the last wave went into exile. So the last wave was in exile for 70 years, as well as the first wave was in exile for 70 years. It's just kind of one of those things where God doesn't do things haphazardly. Everything correlates. That's an interesting phrase. You might want to study that, by the hand of. It's only in the Old Testament 24 times. He's the only prophet that it says that things came by the hand of. They usually had visions or other things. I don't know if that means anything, but it's an interesting study. And that's all I have. I got 2 short chapters. But it was a message that is enduring for all of us, even up until today. Get your priorities straight. Get your motives right. Good things will happen because God says, "Lo, I'll be with you." Always, even until the end of the age. Work hard and be patient. And and watch. We never see things coming tomorrow, but when we look back, we can almost always see that God has worked in our lives. He's been there, even when we just didn't realize it or understand how. We always offer an invitation at the end of class on Wednesday. If anybody has any needs that they have, they want to talk to the elders about, or the preacher, or need the prayers of this congregation, we'll do that at this time. We stand and sing.
There's a fountain free just for you and me. Let her taste of age to its rain. There's a fountain of love from the source above, and He bids us all freely drink. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? It's for you and me. Thirsty soul, hear the welcome call. There's a fountain open for all. Thank you, Ron. Good lesson.